Okay. All right. Well, thanks for joining everybody, and we will get going. Don't wait on that, please. So I'm Dr. Ashely Wagner with Equinutrix, and tonight we're going to talk about what is my horse really eating? How do we interpret these labels that are on all of these products, whether it be feed tags or supplements? So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to go through the feed tags. What are the rules? Are there any rules? We're going to talk about a guaranteed analysis. What is that? What does it mean? The ingredient statement, and then the feeding directions. And from there, we will talk about the examples. So because it doesn't mean anything to you guys if I tell you just what the rules are, unless we actually see it live. Then we'll go from feed tags to actually looking at supplement labels. Again, same kind of thing. What are the rules? And then some examples of products. So it's a mess out there. I mean, some feed products are beautiful, pretty colors of horses. Others have claims. Others might also have pictures of cows and goats, or pictures of nothing but the brand. It kind of seems like it's the wild, wild west, but it actually isn't. There are a lot of rules that all of these feed companies have to follow in order to manufacture and sell feed in the United States. And actually, the kind of governing body or the association that was formed about 100 years ago. And this is the Association of the American Feed Coalition, Control Officials. And what that was is they all state feed officials got together because for every state they had a different official. And they all got together along with manufacturers of feed at the time and the FDA, and they formed the AFCO kind of organization. And what AFCO has done is they were trying to make some kind of uniformity from state to state, because at that time in Texas, you might have to follow a certain rule versus, Arkansas. So they wanted it to be consistent across the US. And what they came up with, we still follow today. Obviously, there have been a number of changes over the years. The product can have a brand name, and you can have the product name on it. But all products are required to have a purpose statement. So what is the purpose of feeding this? And then who is going to be given this feed? So the animal class. And then where we're going to spend the majority of our time talking tonight is the guaranteed analysis, the ingredients, and the feeding directions. And lastly, they are required also to have the manufacturer's information. And this is just telling, you who made this feed, how do you get in contact with them? So to really dive in, what is a guaranteed analysis? Well, essentially it's the manufacturer's nutrient guarantee. So what nutrients are inside that bag? And it's often listed as a maximum or a minimum. And this is based on the AFCO rules. Because you're making noise. Sorry about that. Kids, homeschooling, all the things that we're doing in COVID-19 living. Why do these nutrient lists differ from bag to bag? Are there any rules for which nutrients they're listing on these bags? And actually there are a lot of rules. First, there is a certain amount of nutrients and specific nutrients that the bag must display. And that is the crude protein, the crude fat, and the crude fiber. If you notice, some of these are minimum amounts and others are maximum amounts. And this is because it might vary from batch to batch. So that manufacturer has to guarantee there is a minimum of this much crude protein. And the bag does not exceed a maximum amount of this much crude fiber. Along the fiber lines, you also are required to list the acid detergent fiber, neutral detergent fiber. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these more. So I know if I'm it sounds like, what do all these acronyms mean? We'll explain that from a plant perspective here shortly. They also are required to list the minimum and the maximum of calcium, the minimum of phosphorus. And then some other minerals such as copper, selenium, and zinc, and vitamin A. Now, these rules are there, but there are exemptions. Specifically, if we look at this list, copper only has to be listed and vitamin A if it's added additionally to the feed. Also, there are some bags that have way longer lists on their guaranteed analysis than this. And there are rules for what we add on top. And AFCO outlines all of that, specifically things like sugar and starch and maybe different probiotics. And so they have rules about how that is written on the bag. So I mentioned a lot of things called crude this and crude that. This can seem very foreign. It really is just referring to the laboratory testing, so the actual method. For example, crude protein is just a percentage of based on nitrogen in the feed. So when they do this, they test for the amount of nitrogen and they multiply it by 6.25, because protein is made up of amino acids and all amino acids contain nitrogen. For the crude fat, this is also a percentage, and this is just the total fats. So they're not breaking it down by the type of fat, just total fat. And then lastly, we talked about crude fiber, and this is just cell wall components. It can consist of hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin, and the amount of those cell wall components included is going to vary by what is actually in that bag, whether we're talking about it coming from oats or we're talking about it coming from alfalfa meal. So what? If we go and we look at how carbohydrates are analyzed, this might make some of these, especially the fiber pieces, make a little more sense. So if you were to take a hay sample and to send it away to a lab to have it analyzed, it's going to come back with things like crude fiber, acid detergent fiber, and neutral detergent fiber. Well, what does that mean? So these fiber components, mammals can't digest very well. So horses have the benefit of being hindgut fermenters, and they are actually able to utilize this portion much better than people do. So we've got our acid detergent fiber, and that's the cellulose and lignin, and this is part of this plant cell wall. And then our neutral detergent fiber, which contains all three. If you are getting a hay sample, and so I'm kind of going a bit on a tangent just since we're talking about carbohydrates, you may get it to come back with something like water-soluble carbohydrates, but it's not likely you're going to see that on a feed bag. But the water-soluble carbohydrates are the sugar and the fructans, and our ethanol-soluble carbohydrates is just sugar. Now, what you might see on a feed bag is starch and sugar. It might be separate, or it could be listed together as the non-structural carbohydrate, which is starch plus sugar. And this is especially important if you're trying to feed a low-starch diet, to pay attention to those nutrient analysis. So on that guaranteed analysis. So we've talked a little bit about that guaranteed analysis. The next part of the rules are the list of ingredients. So we know the nutrition that's in the feed from the guaranteed analysis, but the ingredient list tells us what is actually making up that nutrition. So it can be listed as the name of each individual ingredient or collective terms. And I'm going to go through some examples of both of those. But what's really important about this is they're listed in order of inclusion. So the one at the beginning is going to be at a highest rate, whereas the one at the end at the lowest rate. So we've talked about the rules, but they're just rules, and it's hard to really put that into practice unless we have examples. So here I have listed several different senior feeds. What I want everyone to look at really is this guaranteed analysis is way more in depth than those rules had suggested that were what were required. You know, if we look at what's required, so this is straight out of the AFCO manual, we've got our guaranteed analysis is very short. We've got what the product is. So this would be their name, Bluebird 12% textured horse feed. And then the purpose, it's for maintenance, an animal class mature horse. But going back to that guaranteed analysis, that's a world different from what we're seeing on these actual feed bags. Well, why would a company do that? Mainly consumer demand. There's a big push for, low starch diets. So a lot of times we'll list, the feed companies will list starch. Also amino acids. So when we talked about what's required, crude protein is required, but that's just a calculation from nitrogen. What the horse actually needs to satisfy their requirements are amino acids. So a lot of times you'll see there's several feed companies listing those amino acids out. And then people are interested in different vitamins and minerals than what's just required. So they may list those as well. The other reason is marketing, especially if this feed is adding probiotics, for example, or any kind of, direct fed microbial, this is, if they put that in there and they list it, that's a way for them to really showcase that their product is different than their competitors. So if we go from there and we look at the ingredient list, I'm going to take a little more time than I did on the guaranteed analysis, because we're going to circle back to that when we put this into practice. But what I want to show here is all of these are actual ingredients for each one of these examples. Remember I said you could use collective terms, and I'll show you an example of that next. But for this one here, these are all senior feeds. This one here, the first ingredient is dehydrated alfalfa meal. So what is used the most in making this feed is dehydrated alfalfa meal. The other thing I want to point out in here, in addition to all of the ingredients that are detailed, is this feed manufacturer is actually telling you, okay, so ascorbic acid, if you don't know what that is, they're telling you it's a source of vitamin C, or, minodione sodium bisulfate complex is a source of vitamin K. And potassium sorbate is actually just a preservative. So they're not only listing the ingredients, they're also trying to help the consumer understand why certain things are included, which is very beneficial. We see the same thing here for this feed. Their first ingredient is wheat middlings. And if we go right on down, we can find, again, we've got explanations of certain ingredients. But what I do want to point out from this one here, sorry, we've got somebody coming in. Thanks for joining us. What we can see here, and I want to point out, is natural and artificial flavors. So this is an example of a collective term. And we'll go and talk more about collective terms next. Again, here we've got another senior feed and their list of ingredients. This one as well, this one starts out with soybean hulls. But what I like about this too is they're